Hello, NAS 4983, and welcome to Module 2. So, this is the first of two module lectures for Module 2. The first being language loss, kind of in general. The second is going to be about the specific stages of language loss and ties in very closely to the required reading from Fishman, which that reading can be a lot, so that's why I made lecture slides and videos specifically about it so we could go over it. But first, before we do that, let's talk about language loss. So, it is true that languages have always died. For as long as there's been people that were able to speak, they have had languages and they have used them. Those languages have died and new languages have come to replace them. It's an absolute fact. No one really speaks Latin anymore as their first language. Ancient Greek is very different from modern Greek, and so maybe languages don't completely die, but they change significantly enough to where they're almost not the same thing anymore, and that can be said of probably most languages. And then, of course, there's languages that completely disappear as their people disappear for different reasons. So, a linguist, Michael Krauss, he studies the evolution of language over time, and he says about 10,000 years ago, so way back in the past, there were anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 languages. So, a good kind of middle ground estimate is about 12,000 languages in the world. And if you think about it, 10,000 years ago, there were way less people than there are today, but there are way more languages than there were today. So I would ask you, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there were fewer people and more languages? There's a lot of reasons, and by the end of this lecture, you should have some really educated guesses on that question. So, how many languages are there today? There's about 6,000 languages, give or take. Why do we not have an exact number for the number of languages? Well, it can be complicated. So, what's the difference between two separate languages and two dialects of the same language? For example, one of the languages spoken in Pakistan, Urdu, is pretty much grammatically and phonetically the exact same or extremely close. I shouldn't say exact same, but extremely close to the language of India, Hindu. But politically, they are very different entities. They use different writing systems. And so, even though a speaker of Urdu can understand a speaker of Hindu and vice versa, they are considered separate languages because they're separate countries. Other examples would be, dialects of different languages that might be less intelligible. So when we talk about being able to understand someone, we talk about intelligibility. So we're not talking about smartness, but we're talking about understanding. And so if two languages, you cannot understand them, they are not mutually intelligible, or you could say they're unintelligible. And then if you can understand the speaker of another language, then you would say these are mutually intelligible. We can understand each other. So there's a lot of gray lines when it comes to the difference between dialects of a language versus what is a complete and distinct language, and the political ramifications. So we say there's about 6,000 languages today, and maybe there are uncontacted people in very remote places that we just don't know yet that they have a different language or dialect. So minority languages, and when we talk about minority languages, we're talking about, languages that aren't in the big 6 to 10. So like English, obviously, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, French, these kind of global languages. We're talking about languages outside of that. Minority languages are under pressure. And that really means that the people who speak these languages are under pressure to speak other languages. So, why? Well, there's lots and lots of reasons, and it's different for every minority language group, but here are some really big ones: globalization, nationalism, colonization, physical danger, and cultural change. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So, when we talk about globalization, you may have heard people say, the world is getting smaller every day. And in a lot of ways, it really is. When you take in, media, news, music, games, there's people all over the world who know about Coca Cola and Michael Jackson and, American basketball, things like that. So it is much easier now for the ideas of a dominant culture to spread all over the world, not just in their area, but all over the world. And it's much easier to spread language as well through media. Think of American movies all over the world, and the news. People might know more in the news of what's happening in a place that has a dominant language than they do in their own physical area because of the prevalence of that news. And then social media adds a whole new dimension to this because now people can go online and directly talk with people from other places. And what languages are you going to do that in? There's also a global economy. There are people that come to this country every single day that are speakers of minority languages, and they came to this country because of economic opportunity. And so, are they going to be able to get a job and work in their minority language? Most likely no. And this doesn't just happen in the United States. This happens all over. People move from the countryside into big cities for economic opportunities. People might go into a neighboring country or a neighboring, area close to them for better economic opportunities. And chances are that they're going to have to shift their language use to be able to do that. And then technology. So if we think about like the languages of the internet, how much stuff on the internet is in minority languages? Definitely some, but it's far more likely you're going to find those big global languages like English and Chinese and Arabic and Spanish and French. You're going to see the majority of content in that. So if you want to interact with technology, chances are that you'll have an easier time doing so if you speak one of these more dominant languages. And so if you look at the graph over here on the side, this kind of shows like the most spoken languages in the world. And so it makes sense that Chinese would be in the top. Of course, this is from 2019, and a website called Ethnologue does this. Ethnologue, which is a really interesting website, tries to put actual numbers to the speakers of different languages. And of course, it's always shifting and always changing, but they give a lot of information about languages all over the world. And so they have, we're talking about in millions, so obviously over 1 billion people speak Chinese. But if you think about it, China is not a monolith. Every area of China has its own forms of Chinese and even completely different languages in those areas. But there is a national standard Mandarin Chinese that people speak, and we know about Cantonese maybe, but there are dozens of languages that the Chinese government purposely steered people towards a standard Mandarin Chinese to create a more cohesive national identity. But if you think about it, China's a huge place, so obviously there's going to be dozens, if not way more, of different regional languages. Same with Spanish, right? We know that the Spanish spoken in Spain is different than the Spanish spoken in other areas, but did you know in Spain itself there are other languages other than Castilian Spanish spoken? We'll talk about that too. So these are, when we talk about like the dominant languages of the world, this is the top 10, 11, I think, right here, showing these big Portuguese. Portuguese were colonized. We know about Brazil and South America, but they colonized huge parts of Africa as well and took their resources. So there's a lot of people in um, Africa that speak Portuguese, and I don't even see French on this list. And French was definitely a colonial language as well. So another reason that people are under pressure to switch to or shift, I should say, to a majority language is nationalism. So think about, only speaking a language, and we've heard English only tons of times, but you could insert any language into that. Like Chinese only or Spanish only. And so I mentioned that there's other languages spoken in Spain. There's actually 5 languages spoken in Spain, and this map, kind of on the right side, shows you that. Castilian is what we think of as like standard Spanish, but there's also Catalan, which is a related but different language. Basque, which is a completely unrelated language to the Romance languages, Castilian, Catalan. You have Galician and you have Aranese. And so in Spain, there's more than one language. And when we see Spain on a map, we think Spanish. But even Spanish people may not speak, quote unquote, Spanish. And there's been a lot of campaigns in Spain to switch speakers to Castilian. There's even been violence between Castilian speakers and Catalan speakers about identity within their own country. And I've seen pictures, I don't know if they still exist, but pictures of billboards in Spain that say if you love your family, you'll speak Castilian. And so, like, straight up propaganda about shifting your language to this national identity language. So there's, a lot going on that we as English speakers are not necessarily so aware of, even in what we consider like monolithic European states. So a lot of this comes down to identity. You have a national identity versus a local identity. And we see this here in the United States, and we don't even have different languages necessarily that are competing with English in the same way. On a national level, of course, we do on lower levels, local levels, and community levels. But on a huge national level, we all speak English, but we see ourselves as Southerners versus Northerners versus, West Coast people and things like that. So when different areas in one country have different identities tied to their languages, sometimes, like in Spain, it can cause violence. Other times, like in Switzerland, it doesn't. And there are 4 national languages in Switzerland. And so it's really specific to different places. So does national identity equal a national language? When you look at a map, can you say Spanish people speak Spanish and French people speak French and German people speak German? If you know anything about German, there's different dialects of German that are so different, they're not even mutually intelligible. You cannot understand each other. And then what about in Ireland? So in Ireland, they speak English for the most part and have a very, very strong national identity that they are not English, that they are Irish, compared to, British people who are Scottish and Welsh and Northern Ireland residents and England, but see themselves as one people. And like I mentioned, in Switzerland, they have 4 national languages, German, French, Romansh, and Italian. But they have a very strong identity of being Swiss. And for them, it is location that ties them together, place that ties them as one people, and not language. So that brings us to the idea of English only. We've heard this a lot in the United States, that we need English only, but the physical land that the United States is built on at one time was home to hundreds and hundreds, maybe about 500 different North American languages. And so, why should it be English only when we have this very rich history of indigenous languages? And then when you add the languages of all the people who have come to the United States and are definitely a part of the history of this country, it's an interesting question about English only, and does it really create a sense of national identity? And is that what we see ourselves? Do we see ourselves as English speakers, or do we see ourselves like the Swiss as residents of a certain physical space? So another pressure on speakers of minority languages is colonization, and this is a huge one. This is probably one of the biggest reasons that people shift languages. So here in North America, the United States and Canada, boarding schools were the main catalyst for language shift. It was forced assimilation. Shame was forced upon speakers of minority languages, and it seriously interrupted the intergenerational transmission. So if you learn nothing else from this class, the number one way, the only way that you revitalize a language is creating a generation of new speakers and continually creating generations of new speakers. And it's that intergenerational transmission, that parents speak to their children, that speak to their children, that speak to their children. It's the only way it works. And the boarding schools purposely interrupted intergenerational transmission. They took children from their parents so that they did not get enough of the language to be able to pass on to their children. And then they forced shame and forced the language on them. And so in a single generation, almost, it became nearly impossible to continue the language because of that interruption. So colonization also brings often a national education system. So when people are all kind of on the same education system, you have these you have a language of choice in this. So you might have people who are from different cultural backgrounds, but they are all educated in this one language. Whether boarding schools happen or not in certain areas, this is true all over the world. And so when a language becomes like your language of education, people naturally start to think about different things in the language. So for example, people in Africa that were colonized by the French or the Portuguese, most likely when they spoke their languages at home with their families, but then when they went to school, they were educated in the colonial language. And so those people naturally come to think about certain things in their lives in that national language, in the colonial language, because that's how they were taught it. And so can you imagine if you spoke your native language at home and then you went to school and everything you learned about science and math and history was all in English? You could definitely still speak with your family, but not about everything. You could not talk about, being a doctor or being a mathematician or being a scientist completely in your language, because you would naturally think about it in your colonial language. And a lot of times colonial languages become the language of government and law. So if you are someone who wants to participate, or a community that wants to participate in the governance of your area and different laws, you have to be able to do so in that colonial language, unless there are laws to protect your minority language. And then often in colonial situations that if you're someone who needs to access government services, you have to do that in the colonial language as well. So these are all reasons that you would shift so that you could be educated. You would shift to the colonial language so that you could participate in government, or you would shift to the colonial language so that you could participate in government services of some kind. So, another huge reason, and I think extremely compelling reason that people shift languages is actual physical danger. So, this could be a lot of things. So, for example, natural disasters, earthquake, flood, tsunami, all of this. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of Papua New Guinea. It is an island nation. It is one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth. For some reason, it seems like every village, every city, every area of this place has its own unique languages. It's extremely linguistically diverse, and people there tend to speak 3 or more languages because there are so many languages there. There was a huge earthquake in 1998 that unfortunately and tragically killed many, many people and displaced many, many more from their areas. And it had a huge effect on the linguistic landscape because entire groups of people were killed, or large swaths of, large numbers of speakers of some of these languages passed away. And so there were just naturally less speakers of these languages, and some may have completely disappeared. And when people had to move away from the areas where they spoke their languages and had to shift to other languages to be able to live in these other places, and if they didn't go back, then they just, didn't use that language anymore. Same with, so in Irish history, the potato famine resulted in 1 million deaths between 1845 and 1851. Most of those people spoke the Irish language, Gaeilge, to some degree. Many more people in Ireland emigrated from Ireland to the United States and shifted away from using Irish to using English, because they were here in the United States, or they had to move from Ireland to England or other areas. And so it took a huge toll on the numbers of Irish speakers, not just from the physical deaths, but because people were displaced. They had to leave the country. Another huge physical danger, war. So there's been military conflicts all over the world that cause people to have to leave where they're from and go to other places and be refugees. And oftentimes they have to shift their language use from their local language to the language of wherever they are, whether that's a colonial language or whether that's just a different local language, to be able to survive. Disease is another huge physical danger. So here in North America, we know that close to, or it is estimated that 90% of Native Americans died from European diseases at contact. And so those are huge swaths of speakers that passed away. So it's possible, whether we know it or not, or can document it, that entire languages passed away as the people passed away, or people had to leave communities that were sick and join other communities and shift to their languages. And then we've seen this in more modern times in Nigeria. Nigeria has a lot of linguistic diversity. There's lots of small local languages. And as deaths from AIDS skyrocketed during the AIDS crisis, entire groups of people or large groups of people passed away, and other people had to move to different areas and shift to other languages. Another reason that people will shift from one language to another is cultural changes. So there's cultural assimilation. A dominant culture or language takes over a local culture and language. And this could be things like urbanization. So like local areas lose citizens, and they lose control, and they lose power over their autonomy as people move more to bigger cities. And so there's kind of like 3 broad stages that you can see with cultural changes. It starts with pressure to use a dominant language, and this could be forced governmental pressure, this could be economic pressure, this could be, the pressure doesn't necessarily have to be forced, but it often is. And this is a top down kind of process versus bottom up. And then you see bilingualism start to emerge where people in an area start really using both languages, and then younger generations shift to the dominant language. And again, that could be because they were forced to do so physically, or it could be because of education opportunities, it could be because of economic opportunities. There's a lot of reasons. So this is the sad part of the talk today. So there are some grim statistics about endangered languages. So the majority of the 6,000 plus languages that we speak right now are endangered. So estimates vary widely about how many are critically endangered and will disappear. I've seen many times it said that in 100 years we'll lose at least half. But I've also seen it said in 100 years about 90% of endangered languages will disappear. I would say that I would go on the more conservative side and say at least half, but there's probably going to be more. And this always disproportionately affects minority populations. Always. It always does, because they are smaller groups of people and there are less factors pulling in new speakers and far more factors pulling away current speakers. Like I mentioned before, there were most likely more than 500 North American languages before contact. There's under 200 today. And again, when we start defining languages, it gets hard, because is this a dialect of a language? Is this a variation of it? Is this mutually intelligible? It's a really tricky process putting an exact number to languages. I don't know why this 3 is on here. I apologize. It's supposed to just say few have child speakers. So I apologize for that number 3 right there. Don't be confused. 3 languages do not have child speakers. Very few languages in North America have child speakers. And that means that intergenerational transmission has been interrupted to the point where it's not working. There is not a new generation learning the language. And again, I'm going to fix this right now. I apologize for that number 3 being there. I'm not sure why that was there. I edited this from last year and I obviously didn't do a good job. Okay, so very few North American languages have child speakers. And when I say child speakers, I mean like fluent kids in the languages. So here's a hard question. What does language extinction mean for a community? So when languages are lost, what is lost? What goes away? So a lot of things do. A loss of cultural information, I think, is one of the most obvious, because encoded in every language are these things, whether we realize it or not, that says a lot about a culture. And what would that be? So things about religion, what people believe, their mythology, so the stories that people tell about their history and about their creation and about their gods, all of that. Place names is a huge one. And, other things like, I have it listed down here, but definitely place names is a huge one. Poetry, that could also mean music, jokes and funny stories. What's funny in a language? It really, really changes from culture to culture. And so some languages have really great puns. The Kiowa language is very good at puns because so many things sound similar in their language. And so I have a linguistic work that just talks all about different puns in Kiowa. And so as languages disappear, those kind of things all disappear as well. But for the people, for the speakers of a language, a loss of identity For political groups, a loss of a language could mean a loss of sovereignty, that their distinction as a separate group of people and the right to govern themselves. A loss of traditional ecological knowledge. So, plant names, encoded in plant names might be uses for different plants, knowledge about how to use them. The same with animals. There might be things encoded in the names of languages. I'm sorry, in the names of animals in languages that talks about like where they live and how to hunt them, things like that. And there's a loss of unique linguistic forms. As a linguist, this one is maybe not as important to speakers of a language, but it is true that there are universals in language, and there's things that always tend to happen. Like there's always verbs in language. There's no language that doesn't have verbs, right? But there are also variations that are unique in languages. For example, how you mark so plural. Every language has its own way of telling you if a noun is singular or plural, in different various ways. And in the Kiowa language, the way that you mark plural on a noun is unique in all the world. Not another language on the earth, other than the other languages in its language family, the Kiowa-Tanoan language family. But no other language family on earth marks plural on the noun in the same way that the Kiowa-Tanoan languages do. And that makes it a unique linguistic form. And if those languages disappear, there'll be no more of that particular system. So definitely not as important as a loss of identity and a loss of sovereignty and a loss of culture, but something that is lost when languages go away. These unique ways that humans have developed to express language. Here's another hard question. Wouldn't it be easier if everyone spoke the same language? We would be able to talk to each other. If you believe in the Christian Bible, it kind of makes it seem like the Tower of Babel coming down and different languages over the world was a burden on people instead of a benefit to people. But I would counter and say that having different languages gives us social and cultural distinction. There are so many cognitive benefits of bilingualism, to be honest. We are programmed to speak multiple languages. Our brains are primed to be able to speak multiple languages. The problem is that, at least here in the United States, the English only kind of mentality is, since World War II especially, before it was either World War I or II, I can't remember. Children were taught multiple languages as children because people knew it was easier. But people were afraid that it would create sympathy with Germany and other countries, that if we taught our children to speak a language other than English when they were young, and language education was moved more to high school purposely so it would be harder to become bilingual. And so we know that our brains, we've known for ever that our brains are primed to learn multiple languages, and we've known that children especially have very little problem learning multiple languages, and our governments have made direct choices for us not to do that. There are also economic benefits of bilingualism. If you speak multiple languages, you instantly have more economic opportunities than other people. And there are also social benefits of bilingualism. If you speak multiple languages, you have more social opportunities. You can talk to and get to know people all over the world. And so, would it be easier? Maybe, but it would definitely not be good if everyone spoke the same language, because we'd lose out on those cognitive and social benefits. Are new languages being born to replace languages that die? Yes and no. Um, so there's definitely been things like sign languages that have come into existence, and these are full, complete languages. There's definitely been pidgins as well. Pidgins are kind of like mixture languages. If you think of like so a Creole is a different thing, but if you think of a language that's kind of like a mixture of two languages, there's a Hawaiian pidgin. There's other pidgins. Um, these have come into creation, but the rate of replacement is too slow. It takes much too long for a new language to break off of whatever its mother language was and be completely distinct from its mother language. It just happens too slow. This is something that happens over hundreds and hundreds of years. That's why, 10,000 years ago, there was a bunch more languages. So the rate of replacement is too slow. Media and physical location make it hard to let these variances of language take off. If radio and like newspaper and radio and television, if all forms of media had never been existed, then yes, we would have many more languages. But because of things like of this, we have slowly begun to standardize languages, and there's less and less variation. And so, if you think about the hundreds and hundreds of years that Americans have been separate from Britain, our English is really not that different. Just a few vocabulary and like some really light pronunciation things are different. Whereas, if there had never been media between us, maybe American English would be much different. If people weren't writing letters and traveling and talking to each other, you need space and time for languages to change. Slang and text speak tend to flourish, but linguistic differences are stifled. So, what does this mean? We create new words like slay and riz, and like slang and text speak kind of comes fast and changes often. But the hardcore linguistic differences, like changes in grammar, hard changes in pronunciation, those just don't change quickly, and it takes a long time. Okay, so this is the end of the first lecture about language loss. And I look forward to telling you more about the stages of language loss.